Hi, I'm Barry Worthington. I'm a filmmaker, director, writer, and actor, and I do all kinds of other film work as well. A little while ago, I made a video saying that I would eventually make a video talking about what would my dream video game to film adaptations would be if I could do any of the ones that I wanted. So I got two of them for you. The second one I'll talk about maybe in another video, but this first one I want to talk about right now. And I'm a believer of putting this kind of thing out into the universe. I want to direct a Metal Gear Solid video game to film adaptation. That's one of my dreams. That's one of my lifelong dreams. Either direct, write, or act, or all of them in a Metal Gear Solid video game to film adaptation. So if you need that, I think I might be your person. I'm not going to tell you everything I would do if I were to make that film in this video. I don't want to do somebody else's job for them. So hire me, look me up, or talk to me at least. But here are some of the things I would do and some of the things I would bear in mind. And I've been working on my snake voice since I was 10. Number one, I think you have to remember one of the main antagonists, I would argue, throughout most of the history of those video games, is not even necessarily a single person. Instead, I'd say it's an idea. I'd say this is part of the core of the Metal Gear Solid storylines. The general themes, the general vibes of everything that makes Metal Gear Solid what it is. One of the main antagonists, one of the main themes is the absolute horror and threat of nuclear war. And next generation technology enabling that to be way simpler, falling into the hands of very dangerous and maybe even careless people, falling into the hands of terrorists. As those games have gone on, technology in all different kinds of ways has evolved as well. And those video games and their storylines have evolved, I would argue, to kind of parallel those changes. In the late 90s, when Metal Gear Solid came out for the PlayStation, and don't forget, by the way, there were several games before that, but generally at that time, the idea of a bipedal walking tank that was very computerized and could launch something like a nuclear missile seemed so far-fetched and like science fiction. It doesn't seem that wild of an idea today, but the threat, I would argue, nonetheless is still there. What makes that so scary, I think, is still there. So that's one thing I would argue. You can't lose sight of that if you're going to make films based on that. Because you also have to remember a big theme of these stories is the theme of world peace. The next thing would be something that Liquid Snake says in Metal Gear Solid. Liquid Snake said this about, I think, himself, I think also referring to Solid Snake, and I think to a degree Big Boss, which is that people like them, soldiers, mercenaries, looking for a cause, and this is, I think, a direct quote, are losing their place in a world that no longer needs them. I think in a lot of ways, for a lot of people, that theme resonates for all kinds of different reasons. I think to those characters, it means something sort of unique, but nonetheless, that's a theme I think we all can feel in our own ways. So I think that's something you have to bear in mind also. Something else I'd say you have to bear in mind is that while they are sometimes, especially Metal Gear Solid, is sometimes referred to as tactical espionage action, I would insist, please do not think of those films as purely action films if they get made. I told you in my previous videos, whenever I'm making a film, I like to think of it as a drama first. If I had anything to do with the Metal Gear Solid movies, that's probably what I would do. I would totally think of them as dramas first, because those characters are so rich. Their dynamics are so rich. Their conflicts, their contrasts are all so interesting to me. If I had it my way, what I would hope is that if you were to think of my versions of the Metal Gear Solid films, one of the first things you would think of when you think of those movies are not necessarily explosions and gunfire. Instead, like I said, you'd think about the themes, you'd think about the characters, both of which I think are kind of timeless. Even though they talk about changes and evolution in technology, nonetheless, those themes I just told you about, I personally think those are kind of timeless. I think there's a way to make these films still very relevant in another 50 years, in another 100 years, which is something I kind of aim for in my films anyway. But don't get me wrong, there's plenty of action. Metal Gear is a walking bipedal tank, for goodness sakes. Of course there's going to be action. It's going to be sweet. If I had anything to do with it, I'm sure. The other thing that's really interesting about those games, at least with Metal Gear Solid, I would definitely argue there's drama, there's action, there's also some science fiction. So far this is totally up my alley. But also, I would say, there's a little bit of the fantastic. There's some supernatural stuff going on in those games. Absolutely. Which in regard to the themes, I think is really cool. The other thing I would think about if I were involved in this film or these films is that the sort of stuff Metal Gear Solid tackles, in some ways is kind of straightforward compared to what happens in the sequel, which is one of my favorite games ever, Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty. I do not want to spoil that for anyone who hasn't played it yet, but all I'll say is things get very, very meta, which I think it would be interesting, if I had anything to do with it, that a film could maybe explore a little bit. Something else I would try to consider if I was involved in this video game to film adaptation is where does this film fit in the Metal Gear Solid universe or the Metal Gear Solid timeline? I think I would want to consider, would this Metal Gear Solid film be a direct adaptation to the video game, as if the point is to not that the audience doesn't need to play the video game? Because I don't know how I feel about that. I feel like it's important. No, you should play the video game because it is awesome on its own. And so if the goal is to make a film to replace the video game, I'm not sure how into that I am. To make a film that is a companion to the video game, now that I'm a little bit more into in the case of Metal Gear Solid. Because by the way, the narrative of Metal Gear Solid is so strong. The story is very, very present. So this idea about the film being a companion, that's really interesting to me. Doing a straightforward adaptation, to me, I think is very doable. But also thinking about it as where it fits in, like I said, in the grander scheme of Metal Gear Solid, to me is a fascinating conversation. I definitely think there's a saga to be made. Whether or not this would happen in the first adaptation or potentially a second one, exploring meta themes I think is pretty critical, given the kinds of themes that the games explore. I would argue the games are not just straightforward action games. There's more to them. So I think the films can be that way too. Something else I would want to be conscious of if I were making these film adaptations, there's a lot of women characters in those games, many of whom are strong female characters. I would want to try my best in my adaptations that the portrayal of women and people of different genders is respectful. Those characters are so interesting and so dynamic and so rich. I would want to do my best to help bring them to life. I think the story of these games can reach a whole lot of people. I think it can really, really resonate. Something else I want to mention about the inspiration that I'm having to make these films. This might seem really different, but I hope you'd really dig it. I want to say if you want an idea of what my version of these films would look like, sure, I'd point to, a lot of different action movies that I think are awesome, but frankly, I'm a big Greta Gerwig fan. I would say, look at Barbie.
Barry, have you lost your mind, man?
No, I have not. I'm a little inspired by Greta Gerwig to approach a Metal Gear Solid film and an entire saga, not unlike how Greta Gerwig approached Barbie. And I'm talking about from the sense of being very meta, and trying to understand not just where a film like this might be in the universe of the Metal Gear Solid games and storyline, but also in our culture and in our society. And by the way, I think there's a lot of precedent for that already in the video games. All right, I think that's going to do it for me. Like I said, I don't want to just spill everything out here, but I hope you enjoyed this. I know I would probably have a great time making this, and I hope you would enjoy seeing it if it ever came to fruition. I'm 35. I've been playing those games since I was 10 years old. I think I might be your person. If not, good luck. I can't wait to see what happens. All right, everyone. Bye for now.